Out on setting goals and targets in your FDC proposal. Today we have in the room Katie Love and myself, Jamie Anstey. In the live room on the Google Hangout, we have Maria Cruz and Sandra Rentis from the Netherlands, as well as Claudia from Austria. Sorry, a little bit spacey there. So today, Katie's going to go ahead and give us an overview of what the plan is in the agenda overall, and we will start with the basic presentation, and we'll have some workshop time to go through some live examples at the end. So please do ask questions at any point if you are feeling lost or confused. You can ask questions either in the Q&A, or if you are joined in with the live room, just put your finger up and we will note that and ask you your question.
Okay, so this is a whole new world for us to try out these Google Hangouts. I must admit I am hesitant to use them sometimes because the technology part of it can be a little troublesome, but we have some really great expertise in the room. And it's just another way for us to have a conversation. So obviously the feel of this is totally informal. It's a chance for us to work through some real examples of what it would mean to use the SMART criteria to set objectives in the FDC proposal. And I think this is one of the areas where a lot of organizations applying to the FDC over the last few years have used a number of different methodologies to share about the programs that they have planned. And the FDC has struggled to really get their heads around exactly what the organization is hoping to achieve. So one of the things that we thought might be an interesting way forward is to have Jamie and her team help walk us through using the SMART criteria. I know that many people who are on the line right now, hello Jan, hello everyone, welcome to the call. A lot of people who are participating in the FDC already are using this methodology, and I think what we're hoping to do now is really understand a bit more around what this methodology can help us to do and how it can help the FDC to understand the richness and the depth of your programs, as well as, very importantly, what you anticipate the outcomes will be. So with that said, again, this is an informal conversation. To anyone watching the stream, please feel free to join us in the room. We still have a few more spaces. And if you're watching this after the fact, please feel free to follow up. The FDC staff is very available right now in this month to support anyone who is going to be eligible for a proposal to help you write your proposal. And please ask us any questions that FDC supports. And with no further ado, and with big thanks to Jamie and Maria, I want to turn it over to you, Jamie, and let's start sharing your presentation.
Okay, so setting goals and targets in your FDC proposal can be done.
Should I broadcast now?
We are already live, that's what it's.
No, I mean, should I share your presentation?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Sorry. So hopefully it's short.
Okay.
So as you can see in the viewer, it's a SMART annual plan approach is how we're conceiving of this discussion today. Just an overview of what are goals, targets, outcomes, and impacts, and how this somewhat jargony terms can get confusing for us. To be clear, we will focus on goals and objectives today, but targets, outcomes, and impact are essentially those things that make up your objectives. They're the sort of end goal specified in a way that you can measure it and explain it to a point of saying how much it will change and how it will change for who and what. So we will go through that in much more detail, but in overview, basically your goals go with your change theory. We have some existing resources already on the evaluation portal for anyone who hasn't been exposed yet to logic modeling and theory of change. We have some resources linked in this presentation that you can use. So to separate out some of these things, what we are most familiar with often in planning is a vision and sometimes a mission and even a basic goal for what we want to do. To give examples of that, a vision is a concise statement of the desired condition overall. A mission is a concise statement of your purpose and why you want to make effects to any sort of conditions. A goal is your expected impact. So it's the most broad statement of your expected impact, whereas measurable results can sort of be broken into two categories, one being your targets, outcomes, or objectives, all essentially synonymous words. And another one is your performance measures, which are strictly quantitative and ongoing measurements, whereas measurable results that are just your targets, outcomes, and objectives may be either qualitative or quantitative, and they are at the same time measurable statements, but they're not necessarily as metric oriented, and they could be, of course, in a qualitative nature. So here at this link, you find this with some examples if you would like to reference back if you should get confused at any point. Returning to the full screen, the other resource that is linked on here is this logic model change of outcomes, which is what some people have been exposed to in the evaluation workshops we have held over the last year and a half. Not everyone has been. We do provide basic guidance and an example of a logic model with some example, essentially outcomes and outputs at each different level of your program that you may be find of interest and be targeting within your own. This is really just a skeleton and some examples. Your program will obviously differ. It may differ from somebody else who's doing the same program, or it may be exactly identical to somebody doing the same program. We encourage your use of those resources in helping to flesh out your theory of change and what your actual plan is for each of your projects and programs within your annual plan, so that you can more clearly decide what your targets should be. So importantly, goals are what you frame your impact targets around. So a goal is a statement of the problem or situation that's to be addressed by your projects and programs. They help to explain what it is you intend to change, and they identify the measured difference between what is and what should be or what you would like to be reality. So goals allow for learning to make informed decisions. Why we want goals is because we need to know how to measure our progress in meeting those goals in order to help us improve our program design so that we are successful, as well as to provide accountability to both funders and other stakeholders and ourselves, so we know if we're actually doing what we say we're doing. This creates transparency of efforts as well as outcomes and helps us to promote interorganizational learning so that not only you learn that something works or doesn't work, you're able to share that in a systematic way and understanding so that other people can benefit from the same experiences. So goals, again, are the most broad and future-oriented statement of the desired situation. So an example is to increase the quality content on Wikipedia. This, of course, is one of the primary goals of most anything any of us is doing. Other example goals are plentiful. There's increased contributions to the projects, increase the usefulness, usability, and use of contributions, increase people's editing and contributing skills, making contributing fun, making contributing easier, recruiting new and retaining new and existing users to contribute more. These are some of those most common goals that we see listed in the current proposals, as well as we also talk about in regular everyday speak about what we're doing. So bringing it beyond goals, we really want to focus on objectives. And objectives are those things that actually provide the guidelines for how we know we accomplish a goal. So an objective identifies the target groups as well as the activity, the who and what will change and why it will change. So for example, we will increase the number of instructors who are using Wikipedia in their classroom because we're going to train them in how to use Wikipedia in their classroom. Now we suddenly know what we're going to do, change who, and who we are going to change. It states the expected results. What will the change look like and where will we see that change? It specifies the degree of change in measurable terms. So how much will it change and how will that change be measured? Or where will we see that in terms of measurement? And it also identifies, importantly, identifies the timeline for the change. When will the change have happened and what sort of rollout of change will we see? Most often, we all know that we'll see more change over time, and it gets somewhat tricky to try to focus on 3 different points of time and what change you will see in one statement if they're actually not the same objective. And so this is where we often need to split out objectives based on the timeline, because it's supposed to identify a specific timeline for change when you make the statement itself. I hopefully haven't lost anyone yet. We will be going through this in detail, each step sort of delving deeper. So I don't know why it's not answering. Okay, that was really weird. So that was supposed to come slower. It wasn't supposed to come slowly in that fashion, but okay. Identifying the specific target group, so the who and what. Here you see that I'm coding this red in the example below. Providing the what and the why of the change have been coded yellow and green in the example below, and identifying the target of the when and how change will be measured is in the purple down below. And you can we increase the number of edits is the what, made on demography. It's what will change. It's a target for change. By 10% each month is the when and how well, how much in this case, and through themed edit-a-thon events is the why we expect this change with students at the university back to the other target groups. So there's a target group for who you're going to do something to, and then there's a target for what that group might do to Wikimedia, right? So that is just one example of an objective as a goal statement. Importantly, the objectives are building blocks and steps towards achieving a goal, so you're not going to have just one or even just systematically any number at all. Some goals are going to have 5 objectives, and some are going to have 1. Some might even have 10. It really depends on how big of a project it is and how much measurement you're planning on doing and at what frequency. So remember that objectives are building blocks towards a goal, and they should happen and be mapped as a chain of outcomes. So one outcome leading to the next outcome, leading to the next outcome, and each of those should really be defined as its own SMART objective. I shouldn't have used the word SMART quite yet. The other thing about objectives is they are specific and concise. So the SMART protocol that we will be discussing helps you to make sure that they're both specific and concise. But it's not going to necessarily tell you when you're overloading an objective. So that's something you're going to have to remember on your own, is to be concise. If you find yourself talking about too many things or too many targets in one statement, it will look like a really long sentence. It will look more like a paragraph or a run-on sentence, and that is a flag that we have missed being concise. It is really easy to do. We will go through some real examples at the end, and we will probably see this as a point in which we can begin to come together and communicate more consistently and model these things across projects so that we can, start to have a lot more go-to sort of targets that we will share, whereas currently we don't necessarily share a lot of targets because they tend to be a little bit varied and more all over the map than when we actually make them really specific and we can say, yes, we have the same one, let's have that same thing and state it the same way. The other thing is about objectives is you have objectives that fit into 3 broad categories. There's process objectives. These are the objectives for your outputs of your programs. Those immediate outcomes, I'm going to do this and this is what's going to have happened. This would be, we're going to have, say, 10 edit-a-thon events, or we're going to make sure 20 participants show up to our photo contest or photo outing on this particular event date. Those are important and useful for your project management especially, but they're not necessarily the most important for measuring impact. They are important for knowing if you're making progress towards potential impact and doing what you thought you were doing, but the second type of outcome or objective, the outcome objective, focused on short-term and intermediate outcomes, are really the outcomes that people want to see in your proposals. Those are really the outcomes that are measuring your success in an actual meaningful way in the time that you are able to within your projects. So the third type of category of objectives is an impact objective, and you are very rarely going to see these as SMART objectives, because they're simply too long-term. While we might have the lofty goal that we know, we aren't going to really necessarily be super specific in how or how much that will change and over time until we start actually moving and progressing and meeting our short and intermediate outcomes. So for the purposes of your proposals, it's important to maintain your process outcomes as part of your project management and project design. But it's really those short-term and intermediate outcomes you want to get to and drive your SMART objectives forward. So applying a SMART process. This word's thrown around all over the place. Everyone is talking SMART objectives, SMART goals, SMART process. It's just another acronym that comes with a set of standards for you to make sure are being met in your written objective. So the S is simply for specific. Be specific. Don't leave any doubt to what, where, how, or who, or anything like that. It needs to be clearly stated, not a general people isn't the right term. If you're teaching students and you're working with teachers, don't say community members, say teachers and students. Make sure you're specific to who is doing exactly what they're doing in these statements. They need to be measurable. So not only does it say that people are going to contribute to projects, it would say how they're contributing projects and in a way that it is a measurable difference. So they will increase the number of edits, or they will add so many bytes, or you will create so many new accounts. But what is the specific outcome that you intend to measure? It's not like you can measure everything, so here is where you have to choose, and sometimes focus on that thing that you think you're going to move the most with your program or project. The A is for achievable, also attainable, and is often used here. It means that it's within reason that you could actually affect the change that you are expecting to measure. So don't set a target that's impossible. We know that getting 100% response rate on a survey is impossible. If you expect to have 100% of your participants indicate that they grew in some way, you're probably setting it too high when you know you're going to not even have 100% people respond. So look to other people and their experiences in evaluation as models for what you may expect to actually change, as well as what you might expect to actually measure, to keep it so that it is an achievable goal. If you don't know what the goal should be, reach out and ask what would be a good starting base. Sometimes can be found just looking at related areas, and you might not have a starting point yourself to know. That's completely normal. Sometimes your objective for the first round might be, your SMART objective would be to establish a baseline from which you plan to then grow at a rate that you're going to determine in your exploratory period or something. And there's a lot of variability, but most importantly, you want to write the most achievable and reasonable goal and to share, because this is essentially what you're holding yourself accountable to. Okay. Relevant is the R, also called, well, relevant or related. Reasonable is another word people sometimes plug in here. What this means is that it's not something far out from the activity you're doing. So if I'm planning to teach teachers to use Wikipedia in their classrooms, I'm not expecting that they're necessarily going to convert all of the students into editors. Instead, I would maybe expect that they might have some projects that contribute to a particular category or project, and you would want to focus on that area that's most relevant to see the change, where you're, again, going to see the most change. It's those primary immediate, short-term, and intermediate outcomes that are the most important to measure your progress. So don't choose something that's super far out, like even though an end goal is important to have, like maybe to increase the number of editors in your project overall. If you're only working with one school and your project is English Wikipedia, it's not achievable and it's a little irrelevant because you're not actually measuring those stages where you move the liver. And lastly, the T is also very much most important, I would say. Oftentimes, we don't put a time to our objectives, and without a time, any objective is almost meaningless because you could go on forever without getting there. So it's important that we set a time. If you miss an objective and you don't reach it, that's not the end of the world. It's not even really considered failure. It's a challenge. It's an answer to a question and an assumption you had. Putting a time to your expectations makes those assumptions of what you intend to do clear so that you can say whether or not it's working. If it's not working, something needs to change. If it's not working, it's not appropriate to just change your goal or the time at which you're supposed to reach the goal. You need to reassess and look at your theory of change and your project work and see what is really happening, where is this gap, what is the difference that's happening from your version of what you think should happen and what's actually happening. Totally normal part of the action research process. So why SMART objectives? Objectives that are SMART are more likely to be achieved than generic goals that don't specify either the action or the expected outcome targets and timeline. So when the SMART process is applied, you have your program's direction, you have your measurement, and they're very focused. You also have this explicit action steps and expectations that are made clear for both your work plans as well as for your performance review. So this isn't just for your reporting and being judged to have impact. It's also what helps you to know exactly who should be doing what and at what points and stages of your game. So being smart about your objectives is a really, really helpful tool for your project management. Okay, so some example objectives. 90% of event participants will demonstrate editing skills at the end of the training event, I should say. 70% of event participants will make at least one edit to Wikimedia projects within 1 month of their program participation. That is obviously one for someone who does a workshop to train new editors, possibly. You might want to just set a goal to increase the number of new accounts created and who are doing that by 5%. So taking a baseline of something existing and adding a by percentage versus a proportion of your participant group. Another example that's more similar is 30% of event participants who create new accounts will survive as editors for at least 3 months after the event. So here you see some of the, you can use existing definitions, like what is survival, in your definition and of your objectives, so you don't actually have to specify that they will make one edit by such and such. We have certain terms that we share in terms of metrics that are easy to use and can simplify your objectives in this way. Just like in the next example, 10% of event participants who created new accounts will be active editors for the 3 months following the event, which means, of course, 5 or more edits each month. So use those defined metrics to your advantage so that you can, of course, stay concise and make a clear objective for your proposal. So using the SMART process, being specific, again, using specific rather than generalized language, you clearly state the issue, the target group, the time and place of the program. So here is an example of a goal. To approach existing organizations to train individuals with expertise to bring in new editors and new volunteers. This doesn't tell us anything about what we're going to measure, how much it's going to change, or exactly how they're going to change. So we have an example also of an objective. So the program will increase the number of new editors contributing to the Wikipedia. And while this is sort of more clear, it's still not a SMART objective because it's not specific in terms of how we'll measure that. A better example is, as a strategy for increasing new editor contributions, 50 new active users will be recruited from the existing organizations of individuals with expertise to participate, so that they can participate in outreach editor training in the next 6 months. From that, you might also have further outcomes of what the next layer of outcome would be, but this would be a principal primary outcome and your objective for it. So, does anyone have any questions about specificity? Okay. So, on to the M, the measurable. It's important to be clear about what will be changed and how much. So, this is important. So to support activities that ensure that Wikipedia is a friendly space that welcomes and encourages new editors, we might say, well, we want to raise awareness of our friendly space policy. But it's not measurable. How do you raise awareness? How do you know you raised awareness? The measurable objective might come across better as increasing community member support for the friendly space policy to 50% and significantly increase satisfaction with the workspace as friendly as demonstrated in responses on the annual community survey. And actually, I think there's someone in the session today who I pulled that from one of their proposals. So, okay, if you recognize anything, it might be yours. Achievable, be realistic again. You don't want to set something that it can't be done either in terms of scale or in terms of the time and resources you have. We all like to shoot for the stars and make the moon is good, but if we actually set our targets too high, it can be really discouraging. And especially for people who are volunteers out there in the field doing this work often, they're coming back and they can meet this target easily if they were told a target to reach and it was not possible. So for the goal, to increase the quality of information by providing free access to the best available academic and scholarly reference resources to Wikipedia editors. Okay. So this is actually about the Wikipedia library, and that is a goal. So to increase the quality of information by providing free access to the best available academic and scholarly reference resources to Wikipedia editors. Well, that sounds like we're going to give everybody access to scholarly research things, right? So that's clearly pretty big and lofty, but okay, maybe we're gonna have 1,000 editors receiving access to the Wikipedia library will double their productivity on Wikipedia. While we've added some numbers in here and we've reduced it from everyone, it's not really realistic that 1,000 editors might double their productivity on Wikipedia just because they are given access to the Wikipedia library. That's probably assuming a lot, because you're probably getting the most active editors who want those resources, and for them to double would be a lot harder than to double somebody's activity who's doing hardly anything. So be careful with those, and that maybe the majority of the 1,000 editors receiving access will report adding key references to 5 or more articles during their first month of access. So something reasonable that you might expect them to actually do, and more specific in that way as well. So the more we get focusing, you're going to see each of these examples really include all of those components of the SMART criteria by the time you have a good objective. Okay. So relevant, realistic, reasonable objectives should relate and be relevant to the goal. So to use a 3-tiered supervisor model to work with students in schools and produce high-quality images to contribute to Wikimedia. This is also another real goal that I pulled from somewhere. An objective that's not relevant for this would be the majority of most popular students will rate Wikimedia as cool. This might seem absolutely crazy, but it's not actually that crazy if your goal was slightly different, or depending on your theory of change. If you had a theory of change that the reason kids are going to really do Wikimedia is if you get the popular kids and make it cool, then that might be relevant. But that's not relevant to the goal of using a 3-tiered supervisor model, right? So that's just to be clear. It still could be relevant depending on what your goal and your theory of change point was, but I was just trying to make a very clear, obvious, not relevant one for this particular goal. So more relevant here would be that 25 to 50 new valued images will be added to Commons by participating students from various schools by December 2014. Okay. So, and the last one, time bounds, being clear in the objectives about the time frame in which the program will happen. So if the goal is to develop a Wikipedia education program in school systems in order to access new contributors of quality information, you might have one that's to recruit at least 5 classrooms, 5 teachers, and 95 students to contribute, i.e. make and edit. Here we define what we mean by contribute in a different way than in previous examples, to Wikipedia as part of their participation in a pilot program, so by September 2014. So another one that comes after that, the chain of outcomes, because we know we expect both of these things to happen. The second objective under that would maybe be classroom editors will create at least 50 new articles during September through December because, of course, they've been recruited. And that's how you would set up a sort of time series set of 2 objectives. So this is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to have done. Sorry. Tips to remember: objectives evolve from goals and are tied to the assessment process. So objectives are not just randomly chosen because I'm doing a program that somebody else did. They should be driven by your personal goals for your program and coming back from that, not necessarily from what is easily measured, not from what is even required to be measured for types of programs, but from your actual theory of change and your logic model goals. That is where you get your chain of outcomes from. So again, that link on the second slide will help you to a resource that helps with that. Objectives are also future focused. So they shouldn't be, we're going to just do these activities. They should be about what's going to come after you do your activities, after you implement your programming and projects. What change happens? What happens in the future after you sort of let go of your participants to do what you think they will do? An objective should also relate to outcomes, not the processes and activities to generate those outcomes. Although you need to know those for project management and basic accountability and knowing, did I do the 5 events? Did I reach the 100 people? Because if you don't reach the 100 people or do the 5 events, of course, you're not going to expect 10% of them to do anything because you don't have a 10% anymore. So those things are really important for tracking, and they're also important for your project management and reporting. But when you're asked to share your objectives, we do want you to focus on actual outcomes that happen in terms of changing attitudes, changing skills, changing behaviors, changing the conditions or situations. Back to that word. Oops. Oops. Okay, so we had some people share some SMART challenges, but before we go into these, I would like to ask if anyone has any questions so far. Okay. So we had somebody share, sorry for the typo, I went to correct it by deleting the extra M to be consistent, but I deleted the E instead. So for a community support program that has the goal, sustaining motivated and active Wikimedia communities. We see that there's a target group defined. We want contributors to Wikimedia projects. This includes gaining new contributors, turning new contributors into community members, engaging community members into chapter activities, and retaining and supporting the active community members. So you can already see that there's multiple targets within the group. And then when we look at what the known objectives are, one set is to gain and retain new volunteers. So they want to have 2 photography contests, they want to get 150 new contributors, and 5% contributor retention. And and there'll be more at 6 months after the contest. So, that's defining the contributor retention, is that there will be 1 more edit within the 6 months after the contest. So here we have sort of all the pieces of a SMART objective, and I would like us to work together to make it into the actual objective. How do I escape from this full screen? Okay, so I can type it. Okay. So sorry, it's a little smaller now so that we can hopefully type here, and I skipped ahead. So we know that we want to get new contributors. We know we want to turn them into community members of activation, right? I don't see in this next step that we are dealing with the other 2, so we're dealing with new users and activating them, and we want to do this through photography contests. So a SMART objective for this one, does anyone want to take a stab at it? Okay, well, we would like to increase the number of contributors by 150 through 2 photography contests, and so that, and actually that would be a process outcome or objective. Now your outcome objective for that would be, we will increase the number of people, we will convert 5% of 150, so we're talking 7.5 or 8 people, since we can't have half people. We will have 8 contributors. We will increase the number of retained new contributors at 6 months after the photo contest. So does that make sense? I guess I should type that too. So. This would probably be new accounts, but I'm not sure since it's not specified here. Increase the number of new contributors, i.e. new accounts, through participation in 2 photo contests. The thing that's missing here is the timeline. So this would be by the end of the events, I would imagine. So we'll say contest events. And then we also increase the number of new contributors, which means they make an edit. Actually, technically, contributors means 10 edits. So I'm not sure that this is the right word for the metrics, but here you want to make an additional So a question here might be, do you expect that it would be 5% of those that contributed met 10 edits to this contest would matter here for clarity and specificity. Since the term contributors does mean that they've made 10 edits to the project over their lifetime, it would be a point that you would want to be clear about. So do we mean that we will increase the number of 150 people who make 10 edits to the photo contest, and of those contributors, that 5% will edit again after, would be what we would want to clarify here. So
I call you. Yes. Closing the door. Hi, Pete.
hello.
Welcome to the hangout. I'll meet everyone online.
And we'll say one additional edit in the 6 months following the photo. Oops. So does that make sense to everybody? Now we should check if it's right. So is it specific? It's specific enough that we know there's going to be 2 photo contests, and we want 150 people who add 10 or more edits to that, and that would be one goal. It's not specific in saying when those photo contests will happen. Since you're dealing with an annual plan grant, it's a little less urgent for you to have to spell that out. Obviously, you do have to spell out when the follow-up time would be, so it's like we have that in our second objective that's related here, to increase the number of new contributors as defined by the 150 that we're expecting to reach, that make one additional edit in the 6 months following the photo contest, and this is, we actually expect 5%. And that would be by 8. So, is it specific? Yes. Is it attainable? I think totally. This seems like the numbers we see. Is it relevant? These are completely relevant if you're wanting to know if you're making new editors, and that's the goal here, is gaining and retaining new volunteers. Is it on a time? Is it time bound? Yes, it is. Even though that first one's a little less time bound, we know as part of the annual plan, and that you plan to have 2 photo events during the year. So suddenly we've turned this into 2 concise statements that are completely perfect for anyone to come along and interpret. Of course, we want to probably do this though too. And if I totally changed your definition by using the metric there for this example, don't take my version of it at all. Write your own objective exactly how you want it to be. Okay. So we have another example. Oh, a question on that one? Okay.
Does anyone have questions on this? This is a live example, so it'd be good to know if anyone has gotten confused along the way here. Oh, there is a question.
Yeah, I think that was, well, it's written.
I can also ask in sound.
Carl, if you go to the presentation, it's the types that the presentation's not selected at this moment. So it's being typed on the presentation slide, so it's on slide number 20 of the presentation that we're working on the examples. Is everyone able to follow along now? So from this, we had the lead-in of what the program was, what the overarching goal was, and who the target groups were. And then we had a specific objective that they were aiming at with their activities listed and some of their outcomes listed. So we were just taking that information and turning it into the objective statements that would be appropriate for those details. So instead of having these bulleted lists and that are somewhat confusing, we have concise statements. We have one that says increase the number of new contributors, meaning 10 or more edits, by 150 through participation in 2 photo contest events. And the second, to increase the number of new contributors by 5%, that make one additional edit in the 6 months following the photo contest.
So Carl, do you still have a question?
The question was that if it is just one edit in 6 months from just 7 to 8 people, can we really talk about retention because in the objective we have stated clearly that we talk about contributor retention. But is this really the case if we have so few edits? Is this really retention or just sporadic contribution?
That's how retention is defined. It's being defined in these different ways at the top level here at the foundation. It's the same way as it's being used here. Whether or not that's significant enough, is 5% of retained into making another edit significant enough? Is that enough impact? That's really the question we're trying to answer by systematically looking at these questions and seeing what types of results we do see. What is a successful program? What's the highest level we might expect from a program to recruit, convert, and retain a new editor? The 5% number is actually high for some programs from what we've seen. Some programs it's low, but we haven't seen much beyond 5%. 5% seems like not a very lofty number, but it may at the same time be beyond reason, depending on who you're actually getting in the room. It might be, in this case, that you won't see 150 people who become contributors through these contests. Maybe only 100 will, and you'll have 300 people, and 200 of them will make maybe 2 edits. And so depending on what your goal is and what you expect to see, you might change what you're looking at the next round, if that's the case. Because we don't know at this time how many people it's going to take to make the numbers increase overall. If you get one new editor from a photo contest who becomes a very active editor, that might be more important than getting 100 people who uploaded 2 and will never come back. So these are the questions we have to answer, and we don't have the answers for them until we start systematically approaching them across different projects and contexts and all of the above. So. Does that make sense? So I guess, Carl, the most important thing is not worrying so much about is 5% high enough or not right now. It's what you think based on either what you can see other programs have done. If you can't find that, we're happy to help you to estimate that from what we know, but we're still in a sort of data void. We don't really have the answers to what it might be totally unreasonable, but what we do know is that 5% is not crazy, and if you had put something like 20%, that might also work, but we haven't seen enough observations to know what might be too much here. So, and 6 months retention is essentially complete conversion and activation of a new editor that you're anticipating. So probably 5% is a good starting point. So the second example that came with this community outreach, I'm sorry, did someone have another question? Okay. Nice.
Do you hear us?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. How should we deal with qualitative goals?
Qualitative goals? Well, what are your qualitative goals?
Things that are hard to measure quantitatively.
For example, you have the goal that making editing more fun. How can you measure it besides surveys? How can you do it?
Well, surveys are helpful for getting qualitative indicators, obviously, but making editing more fun happens to be one of the primary objectives of a lot of different programs. So let's go ahead and talk about this one. How do we make editing more fun? What is it about the program that makes editing fun? Do you guys have ideas on that? Is it coming together with other people? Is it the social element that you think makes it more fun? Is it some sort of making a game out of editing that makes it more fun? Is it a challenge and a contest that makes it more fun? So what's the theory that makes it more fun is the number one thing we have to first determine in order to measure this qualitative outcome. So if we go ahead and say, well, it's the social elements, we are suddenly postulating a theory of change that making editing social makes it more fun, and making it more fun makes it happen more. So we have a theory of change that should say that more interactions would be seen between editors. If you're making things actually more social, maybe it's more collaborations that are being seen. Maybe you're going to have to do, instead of doing a survey, you might do a qualitative analysis of top page interactions from what happened at your editathon event with the people who participated. If you don't want to do a survey, there's ways we can get survey data without doing an actual follow-up survey or exit survey. You just do a raise of hands and poll the room of your event. Have people drop in a coin into a box on what their rating was, or even just like collect data in ways that are incremental to get at this thing. But if you think you're affecting motivation and making it more fun, you have to have some point of feedback. Qualitative data doesn't mean no data. It means collecting data, but it means being open to the possibility that it's not going to fit your pre-existing definition of what that is. So even just the question at the end, can you share with me if this event was fun? How many people raised their hands? There's a number. And then the part is, what made this fun? You need to know what makes it fun in order to measure that systematically. So it might be that the first steps for everyone will be different here, and you're going to each ask your program participants to just share that verbally if you don't want to give a survey, and take the notes down, and then develop how you're going to look for that either in pre-existing locations of data, because we produce a lot of data in everything we do. Everything's recorded on the wiki that's actually online interactions. The thing is, it's always going to be tempting to choose something that's easier to measure, and it might not be the most appropriate way to tell the story of what you think is really happening. So I caution you there, when you say we want to make it more fun, to move to the next step and say, why is it more fun? And actually test that by getting some sort of feedback, whether it's from a small group of people who do this type of program, or if it's all of them, or, like, it depends, of course, on your resources and the time you can devote to it. But with making it more fun, there are clear things we would expect to see, even like the number of people who would recommend the activity to their friends. Would they do the activity again because it was fun? We know that fun and motivation are linked to repeat performance. So if you think it's fun, you should see that you see the same people coming back. Maybe you're just going to do the sign-in sheet and say, clearly it's motivating them because we have this core set of people showing up every month. And that percentage is 80% of the same people every month. So clearly this is motivating something. Without going deeper by doing some sort of survey or polling methods or some sort of feedback thing, you really won't be able to measure any qualitative thing other than observing, which you can also do. But you're making more assumptions the more you observe rather than have people reflect back their experience. So that's a very convoluted answer because there's lots of ways you could go about it, but there's lots of ways we can measure qualitative besides surveys. And it depends on defining what the theory is behind what does motivation look like, what does fun look like, how do we spot that, how do we ask about it. Should we write a SMART target for making contributing fun? So, SMART target for making contributing fun. Let me add a slide. Okay. So the goal, sorry, that is the goal. Objectives. Okay, so this is probably needing to be reviewed now. So we have specificity. We want to motivate a core set of 20 editors to participate in regular editathon series. So here we use the word regular. It's always a flag. It's not specific. We come back and say monthly. A monthly edit-a-thon series by providing a social environment for collaborative editing. What's a social environment? Will we have team projects? Maybe ongoing team projects? Maybe that's our theory of change. Since I'm totally making this up, I'm making it up. Okay. Now, and here we would expect to see the results. We know that if this is happening, it's not just that the theory is it's happening because it's fun and it's collaborative editing, but we would expect to have some production here. So providing a social environment for collaborative editing on maybe 5 new articles that maybe you have a goal of they become a good article because you got this collaboration. Well, we'll just stop there. You don't have to. And you can see, no matter what, even the qualitative outcomes, if your theory of change is followed through, will lead to quantitative online changes and differences, if this is Wikimedia. Now, if you chose a different qualitative outcome that has a harder time to tie to online things, like something that might be related to policy change, which is a bigger struggle, obviously you're not going to lead back as easily to online behavior, and you'll have to spend a little more time mapping out what you expect to happen, what the chain of outcomes would be. And it might be that it's really, really far until you're going to see the change online, and you're going to have to focus more on those things that are offline and where you're going to see those levers of change pushing along a chain of outcomes. So we are at 9 more minutes. We do have some more examples that we got preloaded. We can move on to the next one, or does someone else have another question or another example or challenge? Oh, is this the new one? Good relations to European decision makers relevant to Wikimedia interests. Okay, so yeah, that's the one. So how would we, let's go ahead and go with this other example that Nicole has posted, which is how would we measure good relations? Sorry, let me make a new sheet again. I'm going to say decision makers, like that. Okay, so here we would need to know what is the activity that's being done. So the activity would be, if I know from my previous conversations with Noel, there are people who go to meetings, like policy advocacy group meetings. Can I get some details on this? Okay. Are you guys not hearing?
I think they're typing.
Oh, typing.
Hi.
Hi.
So the activity is responding to consultations, going to meetings, having one-on-one encounters with members of the European Parliament, publishing policy briefs and statements. Is that kind of the thing you're looking for?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously here you would also probably have some quantifiable goals. It may be not a number target, it might be a percentage. So how many requests do you get to respond to for a consultation? Do you have a set goal for that? Do you know what the normal flow is? Do you get like 10 requests a month and you can really only handle 2? So obviously, while it's a qualitative component of your work, it's still something that's quantifiable, and it's still something that you can say how many you do.
Well, I think the number of consultations we are invited to is in itself an expression of the good relations, because the more you're out there, the more consultations they invite you to participate in.
But it also strongly depends on what is going on, like what topics are up to decision and things like that.
Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that's outside of our reach is what actual decisions are being made in deliberations.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's sort of the longer term impact that you're going to have a really hard time making a SMART objective for, because it's not in your control.
Yeah.
As you get closer to it, you might be able to say, but that's the trouble with looking too far in the future, and the trouble with the big broad goal is you can't really measure from day to day, month to month, how you're making that progress. So here, a good one would be to increase the number of invitations to consult with European decision makers. Here we could also define who those would be. Maybe you have a specific set of organizations that you're targeting. Obviously, then your tracking becomes who they are and a count of them. And then you might say, we don't know what the baseline is, or maybe you know what the baseline is, and you can say increase the number of invitations to consult by 5 new organizations.
Jamie, another way to look at this, I actually just wrote a proposal on this, so I thought about it a little bit. Another way to look at this is increase the percentage of relevant consultations, in this policy field that we are invited to comment on. So, in other words, they're not issuing any consultations and not asking us. And that's really, I think, that is really the measure of having a good relationship with those folks.
Right. So obviously here you would want to define what is a relevant consultation somehow. So that's why it would be like if you could define how many organizations or which organizations you're targeting. Maybe it's which type of organizations. And then, of course, as you bring in more organizations, you would categorize them into whether they're the target type or if they're something else. Would be how you would qualitatively assess if you're making the intended progress. Is that
yeah, they're not really organizations. They're very distinct institutions of the European Parliament. So that's pretty easy to define. There's only a few institutions that issue these calls for consultations. And then to define relevant, we would define the policy fields, which in our case this year is copyright reform. So that's pretty nail downable too. Down-nailable, whatever. Okay, so here you're specifying the type of consultation. So you would like to increase the number of invitations to consult by maybe we'll say 5 requests. Mm-hmm. Institutions. Okay. And this would be by the end of the fiscal year, which you don't really have to say because it's annual plan grants, but for people who aren't annual plan grants come along. So the other thing, obviously, we dealt with relevant by saying which decision-making organizations would be defined here, and we said on copyright reform. Now, whether or not this is reasonable, I have no idea since I threw 5 in there. You guys would be the ones who can say what is actually reasonable. Here we have made it specific. We have made it measurable. We have made it, it should be attainable wherever you set the number. It's relevant because you know that this is the first step in the change model that would lead to change in policy that is important and you're targeting. Of course, if you start to see things move down a pipeline from beyond this, you could have another SMART objective that would be for that time. And what you would see, maybe, what would you see if you are like repeatedly called back on something. Maybe that would be a different target, like versus a first pass consultation. What happens if you have a goal of being like looped in all the time every time they have this issue come up on the agenda that they're calling, and that's another outcome layer that you're hoping for. It depends on what your outcomes are that you expect and what your specific theory of change would be, but this is a good example of how you could make and quantify even qualitative relations.
But it's also a good example where you can see that the number or the quantitative number of requests per se isn't something that we should strive for. If it were only one request that we were invited to, but it would be the deciding one, and we could have a huge impact with this one request, would we have failed our goals?
You probably wouldn't have, the word failure is important and at the same time really confusing. Because what is meant to be achieved by setting objectives and setting targets is to know what happened and to measure against your expectations. Whether or not that's a fail is determined on all that qualitative. So if you find out that that one was all that mattered, if it's that one editor you converted that became extremely active, if it's that one consultation that changed the policy, clearly that has a lot more weight. And that's where your descriptive, your qualitative description beyond that, especially if you miss a mark on an objective. You just explain what happened, and that's how we understand and we set a different objective or a more accurate target the next round. So while failure is it's an important term and an important word, sometimes failure is really not failure, but learning and making a better choice in how you target your next round. So we don't know how many consultations it takes or how many recruits it takes. We have to see that and adjust these expectations every time. So fortunately, that's objective is not the end all of your decision making, right? Meeting it or not. That's your decision making is also in how you set your next steps. And if you repeat a program the same way, if you do it differently, if you do the same projects, if you have the same goals, or if you change them. So when you don't meet an objective that you set, clearly you have more explaining to do in your reporting. But usually that's where either a story happened or you have a clear change to make. If you have a story that happened that was a surprise or more powerful than you expected, and that is why your energy was shifted into this productive mode towards one target, that's a completely understandable way to go with the program because you're driving towards impact. You're not driving towards fidelity. Nobody's talking about program fidelity here. Program fidelity is accuracy and specific delivery that is consistent, and well, we call it fidelity. Like when you're married, you don't cheat on your partner. You don't cheat on the way it's supposed to be delivered, a program. That's what you talk about once you have proven practices and proven programs. You talk about program fidelity, and that's where you run into most problems when you try to export a program, and you find out, wait, we can't operate this program with the same fidelity because it doesn't work in this context that way. So in our case, across the world, across all these different contexts and all these varying programs and projects that are going on, there is not a lot of super level of consistency. There's a lot of variation, and that's that variation that we need to be focused on studying to find what might become a promising practice. But we are not in any place or shape to say what the promising and proven programs are right now. So having change happen is something part of this phase of development and evaluation and program development, and it's something that should really be approached with appreciative inquiry. I'm not sure if you have heard that term. We did have a really brief module up on there, but the extended one's not on our portal yet. But that's really the approach we encourage you to be taking, is looking for what works, looking for the signs of progress, and trying to see is that something that's replicable, and understanding what the actual impact of that is. Not necessarily proliferating the same model to as many implementations as you can, but understanding what it is you do and what impact it does drive. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we are actually slightly over time, and I want to be conscientious of that. So I do thank everyone who joined us today. We will be having an office hour next Wednesday for just if you want to come back, if you take this away and you work on your SMART objectives in the next week, if you're struggling, we'll have open office hours to answer in our program evaluation and design room on IRC. We can also, of course, jump on a Google Hangout if we need to speak directly just to make it easier, but we are here to help you guys with this. No challenge is too challenging. We can do this. So,
yeah, I want to emphasize that this next month I know is extremely busy for everyone who is filling out the proposal form. I hope that it's not as painful as it was at one time. We've continued to try to make it a more smooth flowing machine. But let us know if we've achieved that or not. And I do want to make sure, too, that you know that not just Jamie and her team members are available, but of course, Winifred, Anasuya, and I are also on hand for the next month. And this methodology that Jamie has shared, this SMART objective setting, is really a tool that we're using to help the FDC, the community, and the FDC staff understand the nature and the outcomes of your project. So it is something that we're playing with, and we'll see over time whether this is the right kind of methodology, but for the time being, we are hoping to use this kind of framework in order to be able to all understand across different contexts where, as Jamie said, things are very different, programs look very different. Program fidelity is overrated.
Currently, it's not the goal.
That's not the goal. So we are just happy to experiment a bit with this and see where we can get. We will be hosting some further conversations. The FDC staff will be as well to help on proposal creation. We're open to doing it again over Hangouts or over IRC, whatever folks prefer. So I'll be reaching out to you to get a little bit of feedback on whether you prefer this kind of methodology or would prefer text-based kind of IRC or Skype call or something like that. But if Jamie is done, okay, then I would like to say a huge thank you to Jamie and to Maria, who has done an excellent job of making this actually work. No technical challenges were present, so that's an amazing accomplishment. We should have written a SMART objective for that. And just to let you know again that we are all here to support you and in this potentially grueling and challenging process of writing your proposal. We know that it's very time-consuming for you and for your communities and your other colleagues and staff. We really, really do appreciate the work that you're putting into it. So thank you for that. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate. FDC support at Wikimedia or reach out to me directly. And I really appreciate that Jamie has also offered her and her team's support to any of you or any of you watching this over the next several weeks when you might most need it. So, any final questions before we bid each other adieu? Okay, I see one no shaking head. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining this, for giving this a go, and I really look forward to working with you together over the next few weeks and seeing what goes up on Meta. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.